Hello, I'm Alex Stock. I am the director of the Thompson Center. Um, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event on higher education and economic development. Today's event is part of a longer series and the first event in our series on higher education and economic development. So I hope you will join us for other events. Today's event is also brought to you by the UW Madison Center for European Studies. So our appreciation for them, to them for also making this event possible. And the Thompson Center more generally puts on speakers, conferences, as well as funding research grants and scholarships. So I encourage you to check out our website for more information on all of those, as well as to check out the Center for European Studies website for their events. So today's event will be moderated by John Ohnesorge. John is the George Young Bascom Professor of Law here at the University of Wisconsin Law School, where he teaches business organizations and administrative law, as well as seminars in Chinese law and in law and development. He's also the director of the law school's East Asian Legal Studies Center and the founder and director of the law school's compliance initiative. Finally, John is also a member of the Thompson Center's Faculty Advisory Committee. And so with that said, I am pleased to turn it over to John.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, it's my great pleasure to be here and to moderate today. And I will just proceed with the introductions and the basic ground rules. Our first speaker will be Ana Valero. Ana is a senior policy fellow at the London School of Economics. She's the deputy director of the program on innovation and diffusion in the Center for Economic Performance. Ana will be speaking for 15 to 20 minutes, and she'll be followed immediately by our second speaker, Emanuela Todeva, who is the president of the Triple Helix Association and the director of the Research Center on Business Clusters, Networks, and Economic Development. So Ana and Emanuela will give their presentations, and then we'll open the floor up to Q&A. And so the questions will be visible to us, and we'll deal with the questions in the order in which we get them. So with that, let me turn it over to Ana for the first presentation.
Hello, thank you very much, John, for welcoming me here today. So let me just share my screen, make sure this works. So today I'm going to be talking about some research I've been doing over the years on the economic impact of universities. I'll base most of my presentation on some joint work I carried out with Professor John Van Reenen, which really takes an international data set on universities and relates university presence to local economic growth. I'll also, at the end, draw in some of my broader work on this topic, which looks at the same issue from slightly different angles. So we've seen 1,000 years of university growth, and you can see from this chart, which we produced using this data set that we use for our paper, that really it was very, very rapid growth in the post-war period. The first university is the University of Bologna. You can see there, founded in 1088. Now, economic history links universities to the commercial revolution, the industrial revolution in various references. We've really seen this rapid growth in the 20th century, and that's kind of the focus on our work. And this was really driven by a changing recognition of the importance of human capital and also equity considerations that more people actually should get a higher education. A central question, I guess, in this work, but also in the topic of today's webinar is, are universities ivory towers, or can we actually see them as engines of growth? Our paper, its central research question is, what is the economic impact of universities on regional and also national economies? There's little research in the economics literature that explicitly looks at the effects of universities themselves. There's obviously a lot in terms of human capital, innovation, and democratic institutions. The approach we take is we basically estimate regional growth regressions, and we add in university growth in terms of the extensive margin or the founding of universities, and a number of relevant control variables. The data we use is the World Higher Education Database, which we obtained from UNESCO. It's based on UNESCO materials. And we link this to regional economic data since the 1950s, which we obtained from a paper by Giannauli et al. And co-authors. So let's just think in terms of how can universities impact on their local and national economies? Well, they're producers of highly skilled labor, and we know that highly skilled labor is both directly more productive, but also key inputs into the research or diffusion processes according to endogenous growth theory. Universities are locations of R&D activity themselves. Academics and research staff are producing innovations, often in collaboration with industry. And we know there are spatial elements to this. We can see that often there are high-tech clusters, for example, surrounding universities, driven by agglomeration economies and knowledge spillovers. Of course, there's also a direct demand channel whereby the people at the university, if you open a university, that's more people to consume goods and services in the area and generate multiplier effects. And also universities are institutions themselves with broader socioeconomic impacts, interacting with other local governance institutions, cultural institutions, and the community. A really nice reference here is this book, Research Universities and the Public Good, which I had the pleasure of reviewing a few years ago by Jason Owen Smith, who's a sociologist actually at Michigan University. And he argues that as sources of discovery, anchors, and hubs, universities are uniquely placed to help to address key socioeconomic challenges. There are a number of studies that are really relevant in terms of where our work is contributing. So there's a lot of work on regional human capital and development, which follows all the papers that linked national level human capital to growth and development. So Giannauli et al., they have these two papers, human capital and regional development, human capital, the growth in human capital and growth as well in their paper, Growth in Regions, where we obtained the regional economic data from. And there are studies that link human capital spillovers in firms and wages, i.e. Individuals and firms actually don't only benefit from their own human capital, but also from the human capital in their kind of geographic region. Then there are studies that have linked university research and localized innovation spillovers to local industrial activity. Recent studies that consider patenting outcomes include this study by Andrews that looks at land grant colleges in the US and argues that the establishment of some of these was exogenous and then links that to patenting in local areas. And a similar study looks at the establishment of universities of applied sciences in Switzerland. Some papers do link university research activity directly to local economic outcomes, with the effects often being stronger when university research is technologically closer to local industry. So really, two very interesting papers here are based on the US, so it might be of interest to this audience. There's Cantor and Wally that links the impact of research spending to local economies, and Naomi Hausman that looks at the impacts of university innovation on employment, wages, and broader economic outcomes. And this exploits exogenous variation due to the Bayh-Dole Act, which was introduced and allowed universities to maintain some of the rights to their intellectual property. So just to give a bit more on the data. So in this database, we define university as being an institution that offers at least a postgraduate degree or a 4-year professional diploma, of which there was about 16,000 in 2010 when we obtained the original data set. The key variables we use are the location, which allows us to kind of locate the universities in a region, the founding date, which allows us to calculate the universities present over time, and the subjects and the qualifications offered, which allows us to explore some heterogeneity in our results. And our sample is based on 14,870 universities mapped to 1,500 regions in 78 countries over the period 1950 to 2010. In our paper, we have a number of examples of the trends we can extract from this data, and here I've put the US. So on the left, you can see university density, so universities divided by population in one line, and then the GDP per capita in the other line. And on the right, you see just the raw count. So you can see there's been a steady increase. The slight slowdown and increase in the later period, you can see towards 2000. Actually, this was also a period when enrollments were really increasing in the US. So existing institutions expanding their operations. And the fact that we focus on the establishment of universities here rather than the size of them is something I'll discuss in a minute. So in terms of our basic relationships that really motivated the study, we document a number of positive country level correlations in our paper. That's all in the appendices because it's not the focus of our paper, but linking university density to GDP growth, to human capital, and to patenting at the country level. But of course, there are lots of factors that might vary across countries. So going within countries allows us to control away those kind of institutional contexts. And at the regional level, we find a positive relationship between GDP per capita growth and the growth in the number of universities. And on the left-hand side, we have just simply average annual growth in those two things by region. And on the right-hand side, we have 5-year periods growth in those two things, which is kind of the core of the specifications we have in our paper. So just briefly, in terms of what we actually estimate, on the left-hand side of our growth regressions, we have GDP per capita. On the right-hand side, we have the lagged growth in university numbers. We also control for the lagged growth in population. So hopefully controlling for the fact that, okay, maybe these new universities are just attracting more people to the region. Then we have a bunch of controls, which are standard in growth regressions. And we also have regional fixed effects to control for any differing trends at the region level and year fixed effects. And our coefficient of interest, our kind of core result, is this alpha 1, which gives us the percentage increase in regional GDP per capita following percentage increase in the number of universities. So this measure really captures diminishing returns of an additional university, because obviously a 1 university increase to 100 is a 1% increase. But if you had only 1 university and you added 1, that would represent a much bigger increase percentage-wise. Our main results are that universities do appear to affect growth, to boost growth. A 10% rise in the number of universities is associated with over 0.4% higher GDP per capita in that region. And we find that these results are robust to a range of specification checks and different samples. And we also find evidence of spillovers to growth in other regions of the same country. So we look at the closest region, we just look at all other regions in the country. There's some evidence that research universities might play a more important role in more advanced economies. And using the UK as an example, we calculate that the benefits of university expansion are likely to far outweigh the costs. But doing this kind of analysis on different countries would require in-depth analysis based on local contexts. Of course, a key issue here is, well, is this correlation or is it causation? We attempt to address concerns using lagged university growth, which would then be exogenous to kind of a demand shock that might lead to more growth in universities and also other outcomes. We control for a rich set of observables, region fixed effects, and trends. We also show that reverse causality and demand effects don't appear to drive the results. In more qualitative discussion, we argue that actually post-World War II expansions were not in general driven by local economic conditions. Rather, these were often national policies driven by social equity and a Cold War response. We have some case studies in the appendix on the UK, West Germany, and Finland. So interestingly, if you think of the Industrial Revolution, new universities often kind of were founded, particularly in the UK, by industrialists who saw their region growing and thought, okay, we need a new university, we need new skills. We're arguing it was a bit different in the post-war period. But we can't address concerns of time-varying unobservables. So we can only really claim that these are robust associations rather than a causal relationship in this paper. But of course, not all universities are the same. We know that university numbers are a crude measure of presence. Universities are different by size and by quality. On size, we obtain state-level enrollments in the US, and we find that the levels and growth are correlated with the numbers of universities. And we try and include enrollments in our regressions and get quite similar results. And on quality, the best measures we have available are on subject mix, whether a university grants PhDs, which is like a proxy of being a research institution. And we find some evidence that research institutions are more important in advanced countries. is this all just a demand effect, i.e. driven by new students and staff going to the local pubs and student accommodation, etc.? We show this is unlikely. Our results are robust to controlling for current and lag population growth, which should capture the demand for more people moving into the region. And we also do a kind of simulation to say, okay, if you did open a university under very generous assumptions, what would we expect to be the local impact just from that via a demand effect? And we show that this doesn't seem to explain the result we're getting in our regressions. In terms of the mechanisms we can point towards, within our growth regressions, we show you the university effect is in part due to human capital and due to innovation. But there is kind of a lot that we can't explain through these channels, and that could be because of data constraints, but also because the effect is likely to capture things we can't account for example, informal relationships or innovation that isn't measured in patents. So that's kind of what we found in that broad paper, and working on that kind of prompted me to also work on the same issue, but using slightly more detailed data just available on one country. So this other paper, which I'll just summarize very, very quickly, is based on the UK. So it's looking at the local economic impact of universities, and it's evidence from UK firms. This is a working paper still, so it hasn't been published yet. But what I do is I estimate the effects of university growth in terms of their enrollments, i.e. their size, on local industrial performance over the period 1997 to 2016. This was a time of rapid expansion on the intensive margin in terms of the enrollments in universities. And I focus on high-tech sectors, which are important for growth in advanced economies like the UK. And what I do is I take administrative and survey data on UK firms and universities, which allows me to have more granular information than we had available in our global paper. And I find that there's a positive and significant relationship between university growth and growth in high-tech startups in local areas. And this just summarizes that. So I actually also find, in line with other literature, that the effects are stronger for research-intensive institutions and areas that have a higher initial stock of human capital, suggesting that absorptive capacity is important here. Another paper that uses the World Higher Education Database is looking at the relationship between proximity to universities and management practices in firms, which we know are an important driver of productivity in firms. So here I use the World Management Survey data, which was developed by Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen and co-authors on manufacturing firms, and it gives a good quantitative measure of how well firms are managed. This paper has been published in the Economic Journal. And what we do here is we explore the well-known correlation between firm skills and firm management practices, which have been found in these survey data, but we try to take measures of human capital that are external to the firm. So what we do here can be summarized in this kind of little flow diagram at the end, where we say, okay, universities in a region K affect the skills supply in the region K, and that in turn affects the relative price of skilled workers in the region K, which affects the human capital stock in a firm I in region K, and that it affects management practices in that same firm. And what we find is that firms closer to universities are better managed and have a more skilled workforce. So you can see that here, the two charts show that on the left-hand side, we've got the management practices scores on the vertical axis and the driving time in hours to the closest university. So you can see that the further away the university, the less well-managed a firm is. And on the right-hand side, we've got the share of the workforce with a degree, and that driving time in hours to university. And what we also do, this is a proximity to universities measure, we also calculate regional skill premia, which is the ratio between skilled wages and unskilled wages. And our analysis suggests that the variation in the price of skills calculated by those skill premia is driving this relationship we see with the proximity to universities. So this work is really focusing on that human capital channel, suggesting that when firms are seeing a more plentiful supply of human capital, this is complementary to productivity enhancing management practices, and therefore it's cheaper for them to adopt those management practices when they have cheaper skills available to them. So to conclude, what this work shows is that from different angles, universities have positive impacts on their regional economies. We need more on causality and mechanisms. Due to various constraints in the data, I haven't been able to, in these pieces of analysis, claim really robust causal relationships. There are other studies that focus on individual countries and exploit natural experiments that have done that, which I referenced earlier. But what we do need is new sources of data and experimentation. For example, a really nice paper from the OECD on university industry collaboration released in 2019 highlighted how there's a lot more we need to understand in terms of the drivers of university industry collaboration and what makes that a success, and complementarities between different types of levers that are available to policymakers. And my perception is that this research area is growing in importance because as producers of human capital, universities are key for social mobility and crucial for ensuring people have the skills to succeed and adapt in a rapidly changing world. There's obviously much policy focus on the role of universities and university research in regional development. And universities clearly play a crucial role in terms of addressing the key socioeconomic challenges we face, whether it's COVID and pandemics or climate change. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna. That was great. It's good news for those of us at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to hear this about our positive contributions to the state. So now we'll turn it over to Emanuela Todeva for the second presentation, after which we will open it up to Q&A. And so if for the audience, if you have questions now, I believe you can submit them and we'll be able to see them when we get to the Q&A time.
Thank you, John. I hope you can hear me well. I'm very pleased to speak after Anna because I do believe in the positive picture that the universities affect local, regional economies. And what the story that I would like to present is that it is more critical, more skeptical, because I do believe we still don't know what are the mechanisms that produce these positive effects. And there is much work that is needed to be done in this respect, how we can enhance these positive effects. Now, briefly about my talk. My background is very interdisciplinary and my talk will be very interdisciplinary. So you can find that the argumentations come from different backgrounds. Ultimately, I would like to talk about the role of entrepreneurial innovation ecosystems. Universities, what is the role of the universities? Are they the drivers of those systems? Are they just sitting there and producing labor and skills, and somehow there are other drivers for these entrepreneurial ecosystems? I would like to talk about the triple helix, which is this constellation of government, university, and industry coming together and engaging, searching for common grounds, common objectives, and delivering social and economic change in particular locations. I will talk about the ecosystem players and a little bit at the end about how can we enhance the triple helix impact of multi-stakeholder coalitions and leadership. When I received the invitation from Thompson Center on Public Leadership, I was quite puzzled about the generic topic on higher education and economic development. And there is so much in common between the two spheres of knowledge, but at the same time, they continue to develop quite at a distance. And I compare here a very thorough report by the International Association of Universities and one of the most recent outlooks of, on economic development, post-pandemic development. And what I've noticed there is that the common threads in these two perspectives are marching globalization, marching standardization, and almost diminishing boundaries for localized entrepreneurial ecosystems. Almost there is no role for these localized entrepreneurial ecosystems. They have no resources and capabilities to respond by themselves to the pandemic or to any other crisis. It seems that we are swept by global crisis, and we need to be looking for global solutions to these global crises, because our localities have very limited resources and capabilities. And what I would like to do is to look at some of the old insights on the value of commons. What is shared in small regional environments, which cannot be shared at larger national or international environments. So this is the basic description of entrepreneurial innovation ecosystems. And we can see that the triple helix of industry, government, and university had become a quintuple helix of entrepreneurs and capital. In addition to that, these innovation ecosystems are described by these 9 different categories of essential components: talent, capital, innovators, hub, infrastructure, connectors, facilitators, promoters, influencers. And many of these somehow are related to universities, but not directly. Probably the hub, we can envisage that the local university may become this hub of innovation and entrepreneurship, but many of the other categories of connectors, facilitators, promoters, influencers refer to individuals that play critical role to generating these dynamic forces of economic development. And I want to argue that actually it's not the people. Yes, the human capital is essential, and I think Anna gave a very strong story about that. But what is more essential is how the localities compose themselves in terms of the factors of production: land, labor, technology, capital, and localities that are managing to attract capital, attract labor, positive demographic tendencies, then they generate positive dynamics, which almost by itself create economic growth. In addition to these factors of production, we have to add the know-how, how to put them together. And this is where we see the role of the local authorities, the role of government, and even the role of the triple helix, the role of local stakeholders, how they can balance the costs and benefits, and how they can increase the attractiveness of the local factors of production. Now, this is another more complex model of regional innovation ecosystems. And what we see here, we see complex relationships. Who is managing these complex relationships? At present, our current knowledge says these are these innovators, connectors, promoters. And are they really these, what I called consultants, are they really able to develop a very, very effective model how a regional innovation system should look like? And are they really able to put together all of these productive forces? Now, my question is that, yes, when we see positive growth, we see that many of those relationships are put together by individuals. But what we see is that these bilateral links become a multilateral framework with common goal, with common purpose, with common vision. And it is this common vision that actually brings all the local actors together. And I will give 3 examples from recent research on innovation ecosystems. This is a comparative study of 3 cities, Vienna, London, and Chicago. And these are the findings, what makes these cities innovative, driving economic growth, attracting talent, attracting capital. And I want to put your attention to the to different levels. For example, government here is represented with utilities. And very often through investment in utilities, in infrastructure, the government achieves its objectives to provide the framework for innovation and growth. The others are the same, which I've already described, but very critical in the center are the so-called intermediators. These are these promoters, these facilitators. And very often they are described as individuals. But for me, it's an open question. Can we look at organizational systems performing this intermediation function and coordinating across different spheres of activities? My second example is the mapping of the England's innovation environment. And this is a very interesting map, which actually highlights the critics and the criticisms against this exercise, because you can see that almost all regions, the poor and the dynamic regions, are actually quite similar on this map. And I think that the main criticisms were about the indicators and how the innovation potential was measured. But at the same time, without indicators, the policy process is not able actually to measure and to provide feedback. So in my opinion, all of these indicators in terms of place attractiveness, digital connectivity, workforce, entrepreneurship, business activity, all of these indicators are very good measures of path dependence, current potential, and future trends. So introducing innovation indices actually helps policymakers to drive the innovation process, both at regional and at national level. And one more example, which I want to share with you, is here is the role of the architects. And I want to raise the governance question. Again, who designs this innovation ecosystem? Are these individuals? To what extent those individuals, those influencers, represent the public interest? To what extent they represent the interest of the local community? And can we see in these driving seats of architects some institutional constellations that include different stakeholders, universities, other education providers, further education colleges, social services, health services, and other stakeholders that actually can share views and can provide insights into the framework, the framework for regional innovation system, or we need those visionaries, this visionary leadership to act in this capacity, and then everybody becomes constructors, like putting the building blocks together, interacting, facilitating, and implementing. For me, the governance question is critical, and I really like the topic which the Tommy Thompson Center is addressing about public leadership. For me, I want to suggest the concept of collective or collaborative leadership, where we see different stakeholders, different voices, including institutional stakeholders such as universities, that can actually design and shape the innovation ecosystem. I want to stop your attention to two concepts, just to give you a little bit more insight about the triple helix. The first point is the work by Lud Leidersdorf about negative and positive overlap. Now, you can see from his circles in the first diagram A, there is a white blank space in the center of the figure, and he called this negative overlap, which means that there are a lot of interactions, a lot of events between university and industry, university and government, industry and government, different policies, innovation policies, incentives, but the three actors, the three stakeholders don't sit together and don't shape the common agenda. And on the other hand, in the diagram B, you can see the positive overlap, where there is this small space, the black space, where we have common shared goals and objectives, which are shared by the key stakeholders, and they become the foundations for the future design of innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystems. And the big question is, once you generate this common space of shared goals and objectives, what do you do next? And I have listed some of the insights in terms of what happens between the triple helix actors. So there have to be continuous activation through incentives, through mechanisms of financing. There have to be continuous mobilization, and there has to be a continuous orchestration of relationships. And this is what I said at the beginning. We don't know the mechanisms, how these things happen, how this orchestration and coordination happens. And here is my call for developing an institutional body to handle those multi-stakeholder activities that reach the shared goals and then drive through the policy process towards implementation of these goals. One more insight, this is the a very complex framework. When we speak about the multi-stakeholder approach to governance, the triple helix approach to governance, one of the main barriers is that the helices speak their own language. The industry speaks the language of factors of production. The universities speak their own language of factors of innovation and what drives innovation and creativity. And the government speaks its own language, the factors of normative control, the rules and political leadership. And it's very difficult for them to sit down and to negotiate this common positive overlap where the innovation framework is meaningful to all three parties. And this is why most cases of dynamic innovation ecosystems represent almost accidents or almost case by case, which is very difficult to replicate in other environments. My last slide is here talking about the need for continuous coordination. And we know from public administration theory, from organization theory, that those coordination mechanisms need some kind of organizational formations. And this is where I call for institutionalization of the triple helix, institutionalization of this representation of the multi-stakeholders into shaping the framework for regional or national innovation ecosystems. My last slide is quite rich, based on a much longer presentation which I did on innovation ecosystems. But the bottom line is that this is a field, emerging field of knowledge. It needs a lot of not so much empirical research as we know it in a classical sense of social sciences, but empirical research of existing practices or case-based research, even though there are some methodologies which map the activities of the triple helix at national level, the engagement between industries and higher education systems and innovation policies. But I would like to encourage further research in this field of multi-stakeholder design and coordination mechanisms. And I thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the questions which may come from our audience.
Thank you, Emanuela. So, we're now opening up the Q&A session, and if we have questions, I'm looking at the. I think I'm looking at the queue. So, do we? Sorry, do we have any? Okay, so here's the first question. So I guess I'll read the question. It's addressed to both the presenters. So here's the question: is this research universities only? So does your research apply to research universities only? Do liberal arts colleges also fuel innovation? This is something we talked a little bit about beforehand. A lot of states will have a publicly funded research university, one or more publicly funded research universities, but the state government will also fund four-year colleges, which are similar to private liberal arts colleges in the U.S. lexicon, and they'll also fund two-year colleges and maybe fund technical schools as well. So that's the first question.
Anna, you can answer first.
Yeah, sure.
Do you want to answer?
Well, in terms of my research, so the sample of universities in our global data set includes any institution that offers at least a postgraduate degree or a four-year professional diploma. So my understanding is that that would include liberal arts colleges in the US, but not community colleges. So I think the kind of analysis we've done it tries to get this kind of comparable institution that is considered a university across countries, and that will include non-research intensive institutions as well. Then in the paper that I mentioned in the UK, it's covering just, again, universities or institutions that can grant a degree, basically, a university degree. But what I do find there is actually when I consider the more research intensive universities, the effects I find are much stronger for them. And I think this is something that has been seen elsewhere in the literature, both the academic literature and the policy environment, particularly in the UK, which is that perhaps the higher quality universities are very successful in building these innovation hubs around them. There's perhaps less success in some of the less research intensive institutions, but how can we think about building more of a perhaps the hub and spoke model, as the ex-chief economist of the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, termed it, whereby our research intensive hubs can kind of enable the diffusion into less research intensive universities and enable them to have kind of more economic impact on the surrounding areas.
I would like to add a few more comments on that. From the triple helix perspective, initially the focus was on university research because the universities were seen as those knowledge providers, critical knowledge providers that feed innovation into the labor market. But a lot more research on regional innovation systems has revealed that it is any education provider. It is including the quality of primary and secondary education. It is the quality of technical education. And a very good example is Germany, which is very different from the UK. And they argue that their technical universities contribute tremendously to the competitiveness of the German economy, much stronger than the UK research-based universities. So also in terms of financing different levels of the education system, we have every country in the world has a different mix of public-private components to it. In Europe, mostly we have public sector financing for higher education, but also for secondary education. But the models of financing are so different that they produce completely different capabilities of those educational establishments to become hubs in innovation systems.
So I guess the message to in the U.S. a state level policymaker would be fund education everywhere, and then it may not be clear where the biggest payoff would be, whether it would be funding the research university or funding the four-year colleges, or maybe it is clear that funding. I mean, maybe Anna, your takeaway would be that funding the research university has the greatest economic payoff. But maybe your research, that's not really what your research.
Yeah, no, I mean, that analysis basically is restricted to the sample of universities, whether they're research intensive or not, but it doesn't include technical colleges or vocational education institutions. And we know that they are also very important in terms of ensuring that areas have the right skills for allowing industry to grow, etc. So I think these things need to be thought about in a joined up fashion. As Emanuela said, it's about all the different factors of production, and the areas that succeed generally have a good mix of those things. And any policy that tries to attack just one part of this without thinking about the complementary factors is unlikely to be very successful. So I think it really is about this complementarity. And, you know, also, as Emanuela said, it's about, if you want to attract and retain highly skilled workers, it's also about a place that is pleasant to live and all the things that go along with that as well. So it really has to be a holistic view when thinking about regional development.
Yes, and I think the question is, how do we derive this holistic view? Because nobody has the magic wand to come up with this holistic view. This is why you need to bring in the stakeholders to so they can complement each other in their vision for the region, for the location, and then to derive this holistic view. And also, I think we need also to refresh our system view of the world, which sparkled in the 60s and was long forgotten, and now we realize we are all interconnected systems. So seeing the education as a system, because we know all of these transitions from primary to secondary to tertiary, in the same way like the US has always been ahead of everyone in terms of labor mobility. I think that perhaps you need to put more emphasis on education mobility, and not that this kind of streamlining. If you want to have high education mobility, you need to aim at top level colleges. You need to have much more system view and encouraging and empowering diversity of providers for diversity of capabilities and for the diversity of knowledge outputs. So I will be arguing for diversity and system view.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions. So we better just get busy with the questions. So the next question has to do with effects on equality, inequality. So can you speak to whether higher education contributes to individual or regional economic inequality or equality? So individual and regional inequality. Does higher education contribute to that, and how?
Do you want me to go first?
So I think a general kind of view is that higher education for the individual improves your own, social mobility and outcomes. There's also evidence that there are human capital spillovers. So if you're in an area with more human capital, you actually benefit in terms of your wages, or as I mentioned before, firms also benefit not only from their own stock of human capital, but also from the human capital in the area. What we also know, however, is that when you look at inequalities, they're often driven by the accumulation and sorting of higher human capital individuals between places. And this is just because the places that are successful tend to attract more people, etc. So areas can get into a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle. But in terms of the role of higher education itself, surely this is a force for actually trying to improve people's outcomes and improving, reducing inequalities.
Yes, I would agree with that. The question is that the university system, the way it is financed, actually can turn into a negative deterrent to spreading equality of opportunities. And I will give one example with the UK, the introduction of the so-called tuition fees, which from mass higher education made the step back to elitist higher education. And I think across Europe, the university system exhibits this element of elitist education system. So for those families that are able to support their kids through higher education, yes, they increase their equality of opportunities. But for those families that are not able, actually, it stagnates their social progression. So yes, universities could be deterred.
I would add that I think that the point there is about access to higher education. So there are inequalities in access, which then that means some people are not getting it, which will lead to inequalities. But higher education itself has the power to reduce inequalities. I think that the evidence on the UK from the introduction of the fees accompanied by student loans was that actually there wasn't actually a massive deterrent effect because of the fact that student loans were available. But of course that, just the idea of having to pay and be in debt can be a deterrent to some. And we also know there are inequalities in terms of accessibility. So, for example, uneven careers advice available to different students from different backgrounds, maybe uneven understanding and family support in the whole application processes. All these things open up inequalities early on.
Okay, so next question is kind of a finance investment question. Does state investment in universities create enough benefits to provide a positive return on investment?
My answer is definitely yes. But we still need to ask the question how universities manage those resources. And also, the universities, not by themselves, but investments in the education system. Because if we look at the question of equality of opportunities, innovation can spur from secondary education, from technical education. You can have a very high quality of entrepreneurs coming out from a lower educational background. And through different pathways, particularly the ICT sector has proven that you don't need a degree in ICT. You can start participating in the ICT industry without a degree.
Okay, so here's a question, I guess, about the effect of your way of looking at universities. So, which is not the only way to look at them. So does this reduce the university's role to being job training centers?
Well, I think so. The fact that there is, when you look in the labor economics literature, there continues to be a wage premium from having a university degree. That means that the skills picked up in universities are valued in the labor market. So, on average, there's obviously variation by course or by institution. But this suggests that, yes, universities are providing skills that are valued by firms. So, the role of universities as the human capital producer is one of the roles. The role of universities in producing research, publicly funded research, which we know has generates spillovers into the economy, is another role. And that's, going back to the previous question, why should governments or states invest in universities? Well, it's because they tend to be a major location for publicly funded R&D, which we know is important in terms of generating those spillovers, and this is an externality, and that justifies that research. On the human capital, there's the impacts on one's own wages, but as I said before as well, these spillovers are the justification for governments supporting human capital investments. It's those spillovers on the rest of the society that matter.
I want to add to this question about universities as job training centers. I think this discussion about the role of universities has passed this stage. What are the universities? Their first mission is to develop knowledge and skills. Their second mission is actually to generate innovation outputs beyond individual graduates, which is their impact on research activity. And then there is the third mission of entrepreneurial universities. And those universities then actually create incubators. They create links with local communities, links with further education colleges or other entrepreneurial firms in the location. And this type of universities are really worth investing public funding, so they can actually become this innovation hub and this innovation center for further economic development.
Great. So, so here's another question about the role of government, I guess, versus the role of markets. Is government really needed here? Aren't market incentives enough? So I guess it's a question of whether this is a public good that needs government investment or whether the market could supply this.
Well, this comes back to my answer just before. So, one of the first things you learn in economics is that left to itself, the market underprovides in terms of R&D versus what's socially optimum. And the reason for that is because of the presence of innovation spillovers, each inventor doesn't fully capture all those market benefits from their own innovation because of the fact there are spillovers to others. So that justifies government investment in the research that's going on in universities. And again, on the human capital side, it's those spillovers that justify also considerations of equity and, access to skills and education that justify government involvement in that. And I think I would reference again that book by Jason Owen Smith about research universities and the public good, which really set out lots of examples in the US context of why this is a public good and why, left to its own devices, the market wouldn't necessarily come up with a number of inventions through history, a number of innovations and industries often without kind of the university as playing the role that it did.
Yes, and from the triple helix perspective, also it's a well-established fact that the concept originates from public spending in the U.S. in defense and infrastructure. So spending, basically transfer of public funding for private developments, and much of the innovation infrastructure, such as the internet, also was created with public funding. So the role of government is beyond any doubt. It's just that once the public funding are spent, then it is seen as private sector achievement. But what is not seen, what remains hidden, is this mechanism of public subsidization of high-level innovation in the private sector. So the two forces of government and market, they really have to be seen as complementary rather than one domineering over the other.
Okay,
I
so
would add something there, which is especially when we're thinking about large-scale challenges that are long-term in nature, where the solutions are still unknown. That's particularly a place where government financing for the types of R&D required is necessary, because sometimes those types of investments might be seen as too risky by the markets.
So I've got 3 questions that are really focused on the triple helix model, and so Emanuela, I'm gonna give this to you in a bundle. So among the 3 players in the triple helix, industry, university, government, which stakeholder is best positioned to initiate and to drive the 3-way collaboration? And related to that, what public spending is most effective in the triple helix model? What form would the public spending take most effective?
We published in the Triple Helix Association, we published best practice triple helix cases where we had examples of all stakeholders sitting in the leadership position. For example, there were cases of university leadership through large-scale innovation projects. There were cases when the government sits, particularly in the context of European framework conditions, where the public sector, the public government sits in the driving seat. And there were cases where actually small firms, private sector, R&D companies realized that through collaboration, through linking the helices together, they actually can achieve a lot of their strategic objectives rather than just entrepreneurial networks. So they felt compelled to link to government and to link to university research. So for me, the question is really how those relationships are managed. And at the moment, all cases of triple helix have one arm of financing when the financing mechanism require multiple participation. An example in the UK is the funding to SMEs, which require a university partner. And such a financial instrument actually put 2 of the helices to come together at present, there are no financial instruments to put the three helices or the stakeholders coming together, apart from large investment regional development projects. There were some experiments with stakeholder meetings, but still it is large-scale experimentation rather than an institutional form like roundtable discussions with a public agenda to drive the negotiations of the common ground.
So here's a related question that I think is getting to maybe the incentives for the government actors, or the sort of an assessment of the tensions that government actors would face. So here's the question. Recent research in urban studies of higher ed has demonstrated tensions related to what we in the US, maybe in England too, call the town and gown relationship, including how universities that produce high value research have benefited from their tax exempt status at the expense of local public funds. So if you look at the tax exempt status as an expenditure by the government, how does the Triple Helix approach, or how does Triple Helix approach and accommodate these and other likely tensions that may exist in part as part of the imagined ecosystems? And I guess that would go to the incentives facing government actors to do this when it costs money.
Anna, maybe you can discuss the tax incentives part, which is very economic instrument, and I will continue.
Well, actually, the point that came to my mind was about so it comes down to financing and incentives. And actually, one of the key incentives that I think matters here is the incentive. Well, as you were saying before, the incentive of academics, the incentives of businesses, and the incentives of policymakers, which sometimes can be aligned, but sometimes timeframes can differ, language can differ, priorities can differ. And something I've seen a lot in the discussion here in the UK is that when you think about, so, you mentioned a very prestigious university that maybe is benefiting from tax exemptions. Maybe it's carrying out research that is really contributing to the global innovation frontier, wonderful publications, but maybe those aren't actually then kind of affecting the local area. And I think that the way to try and deal with this is to think about, universities are very big institutions. There should be the people doing that, but there's definitely scope to have people with different roles and have more attention perhaps on people who are actually focusing on this collaboration with local policymakers, local industry, and reflecting that in people's kind of career progression and their incentives. And I think this is also something where I've seen in terms of research funding here in the UK, there's increasing requirements that when you put bids in, sometimes, to show that you're actually working with industry, or you're working on policy relevant analyses, and you're working and collaborating with policymakers. So that's the kind of bottom up view. I don't know if Emanuela, you have more on that as well.
Yes, I came across a very interesting example in Scotland when actually their research of the innovation ecosystem identified 4 distinctive rationales: political, economic, social, and civic. And I think the tax incentives definitely come in this economic rationale when you try to incentivize players to come together. But there is a political rationale which relates to macro level policies, including redistributive policies to address economic growth challenges. But more importantly, there is social and civic rationale, and these refer to local communities, to individuals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and civic rights, and how their civic rights are represented. And when you compare the political and the economic rationales, they are easily employed for excellence. For selective priorities, but the social and the civic rationales, they go in the opposite direction. They call for diffusion, for inclusivity, and ultimately economic development has to combine all these rationales. It has to bring together those different argumentations if we are to achieve um, a concentrated and then growth and to develop a dynamic system, positive dynamics in the system.
So there's one last question, and then I think we will be out of time. So this is kind of a tough one. So maybe I'll rephrase it a little bit. The question as submitted is the U.S. underinvesting in higher education? So I think maybe we could reframe that or address that if you feel qualified to address that. But the way I would rephrase it would be, how would we know if the U.S. or any other country is underinvesting in higher education? There you go.
Well, I mean, I could have a go answering. I mean, I think a lot of the analysis we do here in the UK is benchmarking the UK to countries like the US, France, and Germany, kind of our main kind of comparator countries. And the US is more R&D intensive than the UK. And you know, I think an innovative and obviously very strong economy. I think it's a combination of benchmarking, but also thinking about the local conditions. Are businesses complaining about skills shortages? Are there particular disciplines where there are more enhanced skills shortages in particular areas? Are there bottlenecks in terms of places where more kind of local or US investment is required to try and develop solutions to particular technological problems? So to try and understand if the US is underinvesting, I would say it's a combination of comparative analyses with the countries that the US would benchmark itself against, and localized analyses of bottlenecks to development and growth and how they might vary across different parts of America.
I remember an interesting piece of comparative research which dates back more than 10 years ago, which compared Japanese, US, and European models of financing the university system and the university research in particular. And I think the interesting observation was that the Japanese system has the largest proportion of private sector industry contributions to university R&D. Europe has the largest proportion of public sector finances for university R&D, and the American model was kind of in between. So for me, it's really in the mechanism how these money are allocated for R&D for the university sector, where they come from, how they are utilized. So the model of financing is more important than the amount of money that would go. But if you compare US with the rest of the world, the higher education system in the US seems the most to deliver the highest level of mass higher education compared to other countries, and the highest level of innovation and R&D outputs. So I would argue it's an effective mechanism. Depends on what are the goals set for this higher education system. Maybe it's more serving private sector R&D agenda than public sector and community agenda. And this is where the UK is probably in a unique position for the last, I think, 10, 15 years to establish special incentives for the university to engage in outreach activities, not just in excellence and publications. And I think creating incentives within the financial instrument is quite important.
Well, we are out of time and we're out of questions. So I think I'll thank you very much on my behalf, and I think we'll turn it back over to Alex.